esperanza, amanecida como un querer. Sueño del alma, que a veces muere sin florecer. Sueño del alma, que a veces muere sin florecer. Samba, a ti te canto, de tu canto derrama amor. Samba, de tu pañuelo, que va envolviendo mi corazón. Caricia de tu pañuelo, que va envolviendo mi corazón. Estrella, tú que miraste, que alumbraste mi padecer. Estrella, deja que cante, deja que quiera como yo sé. Estrella, deja que cante, deja que quiera como yo sé. El tiempo que va pasando, la vida no vuelve más. El tiempo me va matando y tu cariño se pasará. El tiempo me va matando y tu cariño se pasará. Estrella, tú que miraste, alumbraste mi padecer. Estrella, deja que cante, deja que quiera como yo sé. Estrella, deja que cante, deja que quiera
Welcome to First Unitarian Church of Rochester. We arrive in body, we who are among the living. And so I ask us to arrive truly in body, whether you're here in person or online, and rise in your voice or in your body, and join us in singing our opening hymn, Comfort Me.
Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, sighing with me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, sing with me, oh my soul. Speak for me, speak for me, speak for me, oh my soul. Speak for me, speak for me, speak for me, oh dance with me, oh my soul. Dance with me, dance with me, dance with me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul.
As you take your seats, I invite you to move in closer if there are seats available so that we might make room for those who are joining us now.
There once was an old and somewhat wise woman who everyone called Grandy. She'd just suffered a big loss in her life. Pops, her husband, suffered the same loss, but in his own way. This is the story of how Grandy faced her loss by setting out to make tear soup. For many years, the custom of making tear soup had been forgotten. As people's lives became more rushed, they found it much easier to pull soup in a can from the shelf and heat it on the stove. But several years ago, Grandy got a taste of a well-seasoned tear soup. One of her friends had made it from scratch after she had lost her child. As soon as Grandy tasted the rich flavor of that carefully made soup, she promised herself never again to assume that quicker was better. Now, like making most soups, first we have to light the flame of the fire. Please join us in our chalice lighting words. Life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift. Because of her great loss, Grandy knew this time her recipe for tear soup would call for a big pot. With a big pot, she would have plenty of room for all her memories, all the misgivings, all the feelings, and all the tears that she needed to stew in the pot over time. She put on her apron because she knew it would get messy. It seemed that grief is never clean. People feel misunderstood, feelings get hurt, and wrong assumptions are made all over the place. To make matters worse, grief always takes longer to cook than anyone wants it to. And then Grandy started to cry. At first, she sobbed quietly. Sometimes she wept quietly, and sometimes when she was in a safe place where no one could hear her, she even wailed.
Let the river of tears move through you. Sadness is the feeling most people associate with grief, but it is not necessarily easy to feel. And tears may come suddenly and unpredictably. The tears may come when sensory memories are triggered, smells from what your loved one cooked, textures in their clothing, going to a place you visited together, hearing a song. You may be feeling fine, and then suddenly a flood of tears will come. Tears are your body's medicine. Did you know that emotional tears stimulate endorphins? Endorphins are feel-good hormones that help us release pain. Let the tear rivers flow. Let the sadness move through you. Let it wear down your hard edges. You may become a softer, wiser, more tender human.
Grandy knew she had to make much of this part of the soup alone. She learned from past experiences that most people don't like the tears. Her friends would worry if they knew just how many tears Grandy's recipe called for this time. So the old and somewhat wise woman reflected on her own special recipe as she looked down into the large, overflowing pot of memories. It was a task she would repeat many times during the next few months. Grandy winced when she took a sip of the broth. All she could taste was the salt from her teardrops. It tasted bitter, but she knew this was where she had to start, and for now, it was the only thing on her menu. There were things that Grandy never wanted to forget. These included the good times and the bad times, the silly and the sad times. And with her arms full of memories, Grandy made many trips to the kitchen. One at a time, she slowly stirred all her precious and not so precious memories into the pot. But eventually, she ran out of things to add. Grandy's arms ached and she felt cold and empty. There were no words that could describe the pain that she was feeling. What's more, when she looked out the window, it surprised her to see how the rest of the world was just going on as if nothing had happened, while her world had stopped. It seemed like people were just whizzing by. Her grandson Chester, who just wanted his granny to be happy, hoped his Halloween candy would make her feel better. He even got some of the neighborhood kids to bring her some candy, hoping it would make her feel better. Mrs. Bloom Klotz, Miss Chadwick, and Mr. Long, all brave yet fearful neighbors, also dropped by to see Grandy to see how she was doing. They filled the air with words, but none of their words took the smell of the tear soup away. Grandy was gracious because she knew how hopeless her friends had felt. They wanted to fix her, but they couldn't really. All Grandy really needed from them at the moment was a knowing look and a warm hug. Mrs. Chrysalot texted her. Grandy knew better than to let Mrs. Chrysalot or anyone else tell her what she should do to get through this terrible loss. There were days when Grandy hungered for thoughtful ear. Sometimes she would ask total strangers. "Would you have a cup of soup with me?" There were many who replied, "No, thanks.
No thanks.
I don't have time for soup today." Even some of Grandy's friends hurried past. There was a family that were friends, and they hurried past her. They pretended not to notice the aroma of the tear soup coming through the door and windows. Grandy found that most people can tolerate only a cup of someone else's tear soup. Now, the giant bowl where Grandy could repeatedly share her sadness in great detail was left for a few willing friends.
I'm here. I got here as fast as I could.
What a relief. No problem. I've had plenty of help, but most of these friends will be gone very quickly. They'll be over my tragedy before I'm over it myself.
Sorry I couldn't get here sooner.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, but I'd be glad to listen. Come on, tell me about it while we make some bread to go along with your soup.
Grandy knew she didn't have to be careful around Midge. Midge wouldn't try to talk her out of anything she was feeling, and Grandy could even laugh and not worry that Midge would assume that Grandy was over her grief. The two friends, who had shared 1,000 laughs and just as many tears, pounded at some bread dough, and when it came out of the oven, they tore off pieces and shared it together.
Here in community, all that we make and all that we share, we do together. And so I invite you into our collective spiritual practice that we practice every week, where we take up an offering and we support the work and witness of our community. And each and every week we share it with a community organization doing the work of love and justice out in the world. Sometimes justice sounds like that. Today and each year around this time of year, we give to celebrate one of our ancestors of this congregation. And so we share our offering this week with the Susan B. Anthony House. Susan and her sister Mary were members of this congregation, and their legacy and their work continues. So I invite you to give generously this week, as well as next week when we take up our election collection. Our offering will now be received with gratitude.
I feel like I'm unraveling. I'm mad and I'm confused, and I can't make any decisions. Nobody or nothing makes me feel good. I'm a mess. I didn't realize this was going to be so hard.
Why don't we go for a walk?
Well, I know that exercise is good for me, but my legs feel like I have concrete on them. We better not go too far, or you'll end up having to carry me home.
So why don't we just get some autumn air?
Yes, to the mailbox would be good. That will do.
Okay.
Next, her recipe called for some comfort food. For Grandy, this meant mashed potatoes or ice cream. Comfort food always makes you feel better, at least for a little while. It gets past that big lump in your throat when other foods can't. I think it needs some chocolate too, thought Grandy. After all, it was her soup. Grandy kept attending worship. Even though she was mad at God, life, death, the community, and everyone really. Sometimes she yelled at the universe and asked why this happened. And sometimes she demanded to know where God was when she was feeling so all alone. Grandy trusted that all were connected in love, but she didn't understand God, love, the universe, or whoever was supposed to be doing all this holding. She sensed that people believed that if she really had faith or enough friends or the right attitude, that she would be spared deep sorrow, deep anger, and loneliness. Grandy kept reminding herself to be grateful for all the emotions that swept into and out of her.
Drive into the grief wave. Because grief can feel overwhelming all at once, it can come in waves. You might be traveling along, feeling content or not feeling anything, and then bam, a grief wave. It can feel like an unexpected tsunami hits you. You may feel knocked out by this or need to go inward into the grief cave to recover. Or you may feel a heaviness lifted after the wave and see a rainbow of connection from your loved one. or some of both. Grief is contradictory and so many things at once. Keep driving. Just keep driving, even though you're not really the one who is driving. Let yourself be carried through the wave by a power greater than you. That power is love. Let love drive you through the wave. Let it carry you and remind you that there is nowhere to get to. The wave will pass. The only way out is through.
On some afternoons, people would ask questions.
Is it soup yet? How long is this going to take? Haven't you been at this for a month already? It's time to get out of the kitchen.
Grandy fumed at the advice. Grandy looked forward to getting the mail each day, but she dreaded the day when no more sympathy cards would come. When she was alone and needed to think, she found it helpful to keep notes on her soup making. Thank goodness Grandy and Pops had been married a long time. They already knew each other's tier soup would be different. Secretly, Grandy wished Pops would put more flavoring in his soup, but he didn't want to, and was perfectly content to dine alone and sip his own soup.
Like for Grandy and Pops, each person's tier soup is different. And it can be different each time someone has to make it as well. That was certainly my experience when I experienced two very different deaths, two losses, during the first year of the pandemic. One was my grandpa John, my grandpa on my dad's side, and the other was Barry, my old piano tutor who I had from elementary through high school. For my grandpa, I had never been very close to him. He and Grandma lived all the way out in Kansas, and while they would visit for various holidays and graduations growing up, there was never anything in particular that we connected over or bonded over. And then for most of my adult life, he had been in steady physical and cognitive decline. And so when he passed away around a year into the pandemic, it was not particularly a shock or a surprise. And because it was in the pandemic and it was in that time between when there were vaccinations, but we weren't fully vaccinated, I wasn't able to join my parents in Kansas for the memorial and internment. That worked out okay for me because while I was sad for my dad and for my grandma and empathetic to their grief, I didn't need the memorial service for myself. I didn't have much of my own grief to process. His death didn't change much of my day to day, and it didn't change my expectations. The last time I had seen him, part of me knew, well, this might be the last time. But not really experiencing grief, or rather not experiencing what I thought grief ought to be, that became its own thing for me to process and to think about it and reflect on. Especially in contrast to the very palpable, the very obvious grief that I experienced about my piano tutor, Barry, who had died earlier. He and I had just reconnected after the pandemic hit because with everything being on Zoom, we were able to arrange some lessons over Zoom for me to take piano lessons. I had just picked back up my piano practice as something to do during the lockdown, and we had a couple sessions, and it was really great to reconnect with Barry after so many years. But then, after a few sessions, I didn't hear back from him about scheduling. So I went on social media to check his page just to see if everything was all right, and my heart dropped when I saw posts from others memorializing him and saying how much they missed him. I was able to reach his sister's account, someone I'd never met, and she confirmed that he just died in his sleep quite unexpectedly. There had been a virtual memorial, and she was kind enough to send me the recording so that I could attend that memorial service in a certain way. So with Barry, my grief was very palpable. I experienced those waves of grief washing over me unexpectedly. Barry was someone who I bonded with over music and so many things. He was the most consistent mentor to me as I grew up in my adolescence. And also, the grief was particular because we had just reconnected, and I was looking forward to seeing him for more Zoom piano lessons, where we sometimes would just talk more than actually practice piano. And so then not being able to see him, not having that expectation met, was difficult. So I had both of these grief experiences, and I spent some time holding them, comparing them, reflecting on them, living and loving through them. And I can articulate some of the reasons why it makes sense that I had that more obvious or traditional experience of grief with Barry than with my own grandpa. But in the end, I realized it doesn't need to make sense. I loved both of them, but in different ways. I knew both of them in different ways. And I grieved, and I still grieve, and I remember both of them in different ways. In a moment, we're going to take the leaves that were on the seats here in the sanctuary and write the names of those loved ones, those ancestors, those dear friends that you are holding in your heart this morning. We're going to write the names on these leaves. Online, you can write your names into the chat, and we have folks here who will transcribe those onto a leaf. And soon, we will hang these leaves on our memory tree, but for now, once you've written the name, just name or names, just hold on to them for a little longer. I shared my story with you to be clear that even as you may write 2 or 3 or many more names, it doesn't mean that the grief has to be the same. It doesn't have to be held the same way. The remembrance doesn't have to be the same. There is no right or wrong way for any of these names that we honor and remember this morning. I will write both Barry and my grandpa John's name on my leaf, along with many others. Please join me in this moment of remembering and writing.
Making tear soup is hard work. Sometimes it was all she could think about. Even the things Grandy used to love to do, she didn't have the energy for, nor did she care about anymore. Some of Grandy's friends over the years had not tended their tear soup. Their soup boiled over and the pot scorched. What a mess! It took them a long time to clean up their pots and to start over. The smell of the burnt soup still lingers in some of their homes. Grandy knew there were times when she needed to take a break from her soup making. Even though it was hard to do, she forced herself to get away. Grandy heard that a neighbor was having to take her turn in the kitchen. Some people thought that the neighbor was eating too much of her own tear soup, so Grandy, being an old and somewhat wise woman, called and invited her over to a special gathering where it's not bad manners to cry in your soup or to have second helpings. She gathered them all with her on the front deck where the autumn leaves and the open sky held their stories.
Being an old and somewhat wise community, Grandy gathers us. And so we take this time each year to tend to our tear soup and to join in the tradition of our memory tree. And so we hold leaves with the names of our beloveds, people we wrote who we knew and loved, but also to names of members of this congregation who died this year, members of this wider community here in Rochester who were killed by gun violence. You have leaves with names of people you knew and people you didn't know. They were someone's beloved, someone's sweet Babu. And so I invite you to rise and hang the leaves that you have on our memory tree, to let these names be known and held in love.
will say,
You are not forgotten.
Arthur,
You are not forgotten.
James Winchester,
You are not forgotten.
Yoshi,
Not forgotten.
Paul Gunther,
You are not forgotten.
Rob Eller Isaac,
You are not forgotten.
Jean Popke,
You are not forgotten.
Cy Preston,
You are not forgotten.
David Keyes,
You are not forgotten.
James
You
Sargent,
are not forgotten.
Michael
You
Agassi,
are not forgotten.
Eric Bellman,
You are not forgotten.
Viv Laives,
You are not forgotten.
Robert Nino,
You are not forgotten.
Janet Johnson,
You are not forgotten.
Marty Irwin,
You are not forgotten. Marilyn Thomas.
are not forgotten.
Kay Valentine.
You are not forgotten.
Richard Fox.
You are not forgotten.
Gail Levy.
You are not forgotten.
Patty Newman.
You are not forgotten.
Bob Ernst.
You are not forgotten.
Mildred Ross.
You are not forgotten.
Daphne Cooper.
You are not forgotten.
Alexander Cook.
You are not forgotten.
John
You
Swartz.
are not forgotten.
Anne
You
Wells.
are not forgotten.
Harish Sanjan
You
Walla.
are not forgotten.
Arlene Clifton.
You are not forgotten.
Neil Robertson.
You are not forgotten.
Drew Vincent Lemon.
You are not forgotten.
Rita Bradshaw
You
Gamble.
are not forgotten. Warren Knapp,
You are not forgotten.
Peter
You are not
Louvier,
forgotten.
Robert
You are not
Tucker,
forgotten.
and Andrew
You
Butterall,
are not forgotten.
Joseph
You
Ingham,
are not forgotten.
Linda Frankson,
You are not forgotten.
Jean Whitley,
You are not forgotten.
Charles E. Hyde Jr.,
You are not forgotten.
Jenny Enola Hyde,
You are not forgotten.
Lucy Di Gregorio,
You are not forgotten.
Dave Randall,
You are not forgotten.
Keeper,
You are not forgotten.
Wayne Wilson,
You are not forgotten.
James Carr.
Agnes Hoffman,
You are not forgotten.
Stephen Friedman,
You are not forgotten.
Bernard Rosenthal,
You are not forgotten.
Felipe,
You are not forgotten.
Joe Rothschild,
You are not forgotten.
Buzz Farrow,
You are not forgotten.
Natalie Ray
You
Freeburg,
are not forgotten.
Todd Stout,
You are not forgotten.
Ginger Bauer,
You are not forgotten.
Janet Thresh,
You are not forgotten.
Elena Colgan,
You are not forgotten.
Jim Nelson, you are not forgotten.
The thoughtful cook sat on Grandy's desk and discussed the process of making tear soup. There are some parts that require help from friends, and some parts you just have to do alone. They shared stories about soup making they wouldn't dare tell anyone else for fear of being judged a bad cook. They all laughed knowingly when Grandy remarked how, on days when she was daydreaming while driving, she was glad that her car seemed to know just where it wanted to go. These people had become Grandy's new best friends. One day, as Grandy and her grandson Chester were going for a walk, he asked her some questions.
Well, when you make deer soup, it's a way for you to sort through all the different ways, memories, feelings, when you lose someone special, or when you lose someone you care deeply about.
Grandy,
Okay, let's just start from the top. Start from the top. Reboot. Start with this. Mom says, just start there.
Mom says you have been making tear soup. What does she mean?
Well, tear soup is a way for you to sort through all the different feelings and memories. When you lose someone or something special, do you remember when your baby brother died before he was born, and your mother sat for days holding his blanket and weeping? She was making tear soup. You made tear soup yourself when you were acting disappointed and told your cousin Jason you wished his brother would die too. Remember when Billy's dog died and he didn't want to play with you? That's a feeling that comes when you are sad. You don't feel like having fun, and it's one of the ingredients of tear soup. And remember when Aunt May got divorced and they had to move away? There was a lot of soup simmering in that house. Someday when you're making soup, you can't even breathe. Some days you feel like running away. You just hope a better day comes along soon. And then the hardest part comes in making tear soup. It's when you've decided it's okay not to eat so much soup all the time.
Grandy, are you done making your tear soup?
Well, I don't think so. I actually have finished the hard part. I haven't finished the hard part of making this batch of soup, but it's almost done. I'll put some in the freezer and I'll pull it out from time to time and have a little taste.
Grandy, what else have you learned from making tear soup, Grandy?
I've learned that grief, like a pot of soup, changes the longer it simmers and the more things you put in it. I've learned that sometimes people say unkind things, but they don't really mean to hurt you. And most importantly, I've learned that deep down, something within us is ready to help us survive things that we feel like we can't survive.
Grandy, you know so much. What will I do after you die?
Don't worry. Don't worry. I will leave you my recipe for a good tear soup, and you will make it your own.
You will make it your own, not just Chester, but all of us. We gather in community to make space for death, for grief, for loss. We gather because the recipe tells us you can't just do it alone, but it's good to do it together also. Making tear soup, it calls for more than one technique. And so, as we close our time of worship together, we move into all ages connection. And so whether you join with Reverend AJ in all ages conversation, or with Sheila to make art in a grief mandala, or with me outside as we move through loss of pregnancy, through abortion or miscarriage, or with Shannon because you just want to do something practical and you want to make grief kits in the workroom. Whether you're online or in person, we invite you to move through and make tear soup in one of these other techniques. I want to take this opportunity to remind people that we have a monthly grief group for those who are wrestling with the grief of loss of a spouse or a partner. It meets on Wednesdays. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for being in community, for helping to be the gathering of people that witness to each other's grief and loss, that witness to what it means to live and to love. And so we sing one final song together today. Oh, I realize I say final, and it will be final for many of us. But if you're someone for whom music is a way to process grief, one of the connection options is to stay right here and sing with Pablo afterwards. But for the rest of us, let's rise in body or in spirit and join us in singing What Wondrous Love.
What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this that brings my heart such bliss and takes away the pain of my soul,
extinguish this chalice today in recognition that worship has ended, just as things change when someone has died. When a beloved leaves our lives, our world is no longer the same. But just like the warmth and the flame and all that this chalice and this gathering pours into us, the love and the impact that our beloveds have in our lives goes on. And so join me in our chalice extinguishing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the lighted truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Go in peace, go in love. I love you. You bring your love out into the world. Amen.